ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Inside Hollywood with Vinny. Today, I'm so pleased, honored, and privileged to welcome someone who I admired deeply way back when I was just a young little, maybe what, 12-year-old watching Wise Guys. Great movie, and I've been a fan ever since. And actually, someone I credit to that I began to really like and want to get involved with screenwriting, and that is the one and only George Gallo. Welcome to the show.
How are you, Vince?
It's again, just to be not to be repetitive, it is an honor. You have an amazing
Oh,
background.
no, no, no. Please, if you're complimenting, be as repetitive as you want. So,
It's a really great story. I mean, you have a fantastic story. It's beautiful blue collar, neighborhood guy that makes it big in Hollywood. And I think the most remarkable part of it, to be honest with you, if I'm not getting too ahead of myself, is that you've maintained to be yourself. You don't have a big head. Obviously, in the short time that I've come to know you, you're very generous with your time, and you're very kind. You haven't let Hollywood destroy you, which is a major thing.
I've always kept a safe distance from it because I always, I think I had enough street smarts to know that if you got too involved in the trappings of it, you might be able to make a few more deals earlier on, but I could sense very quickly that this could easily eat you alive. So, and the people and the bullshit and I'm like, can I curse? I'm not. I'm sorry.
Yes, we. I got an in with the censors, so they'll look
Okay,
the other way.
I'll try not to curse too much. But anyway, it's a town of nonsense and bullshit. Like, and a lot of great stuff comes out of it too. So like anything, it's a mixed bag. But I kept my distance from a lot of stuff. It's the only way to survive. I've been, married. I've been with my wife 42 years. I stay away from all the Hollywood parties and all the nonsense because I think, look, in the end, if you're in, and I use this word cautiously, but if you're an artist and you're dipping into this well all the time, you got to keep the well fairly clean, because once that becomes polluted, you're kind of done. And I like creating and
The creative part, and for those that may not know, you're an accomplished artist. Pennsylvania landscape, which is near and dear. Obviously, I'm from Pennsylvania, so and I love your art. I've seen it, and for those of you out there who haven't seen it, make sure you check it out because it'll blow you away. And it's you're
it's the
completely
it's
right.
the Rich Timmons Gallery in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And I love Bucks County. When I was a kid, when I first got my driver's license, and when I was a kid in New York, I was 18 years old. I got the driver's license. First thing I did was I drove down to Bucks County from New York because I wanted to see it from all those paintings that I'd seen. So
Sometimes we don't appreciate it. I think well, being from Philly, we kind of get a little bit. We don't realize right in front of us in the counties. The collar counties, as they call them. A lot of history in Pennsylvania. It's very diverse. So, but yeah, we're gonna make sure we're gonna put a link to the website for Rich Timmons in the description box. So those of you out there, please check it out, visit, go there, and maybe even see if you can help support some of George's great work and start out at an early age. Correct?
yeah, I mean, I was interested in both filmmaking and painting and writing all at the same time when I was a teenager. And when I was about 15, 16 years old, I was already making Super 8 movies. I got a GAF. Remember Henry Fonda used to sell the GAF 805 had a little magnetic stripe on the side. I started making movies, and blowing up models and shit. And I remember I convinced a friend of mine to jump into Long Island Sound, I mean, so I could film it in slow motion. I mean, yeah, in the dead of winter, by the way, it wasn't like summertime. And yes, I had a natural, love of movies and filmmaking. And I didn't even know really at the time it was called writing and directing, and I didn't know what it was, but telling stories with images, I just always had this fascination with it. And when I was a kid, I credit a lot of this to my dad. He loved movies. So I'd be watching some, stupid sci-fi movie, with a guy in a rubber suit. My father would say, "No, no, no, you gotta watch some classics." And he turned me on to the Treasure of Sierra Madre and the Maltese Falcon. I started watching those movies with him, and I had I think, a very early appreciation for storytelling. So I wanted to learn. So I started getting books on screenwriting and learning the craft of being a writer because there's a lot, there's a lot of craft to being a screenwriter and knowing when to turn the plot. And there's like a lot of mechanics to it. And then, as a writer, you try to hide all those mechanics, but they have to be in the sort of substructure of the piece. A lot of that today's been getting thrown out the window, which I don't understand. But you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of movies today seem somewhat formless, or writers seem disinterested in structure, which I'm like, structure is the foundation of screenwriting, of architecture. It's the structure of painting. I mean, unless you're just throwing shit at the wall, but if you want to be a real painter, you have to learn composition and design, and this eye, your eye leads to this, and it goes to that, and this curve leads down to this, and there's a whole, almost like a mathematical science to all of this stuff, and to disregard that, I just don't understand it.
I agree, George. I think there's definitely science to all anything creative, and I think you get started out and you're like, I'm throwing away the book on how to do it. I want to just jump in there, and there's something to be said about guerrilla filmmaking, which my last short I could be definitely guilty of, but when you start to really want to do it the right way and become noticed and really get other people to appreciate what you're doing, you kind of have to follow the science. And with filmmaking, with screenwriting, and like you said, artwork, there's a science. And you can kind of redevelop things and enhance things, but there's a structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm saying is to you, it's look, I throw out the rules all the time, but I took the time to learn them, so I know when I'm throwing them out. So it's that I was making all those movies, little Super 8 movies with my friends. And then I got a book on screenwriting that Sid Field wrote called Screenplay, and I read that, and then I watched a lot of movies, and I started realizing there was a structure to them, and that there was an inciting incident, let's say somewhere around page 22 to 28, and that was the act break.
But George, you
Yeah.
mentioned on some of these other podcasts, which I think is beneficial to hear, even though the more I hear it, the more I like it. How you you went into the white pages in New York, and you started searching out people.
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote my first screenplay. I was, I think, around 19 years old. It was called Pros and Cons, and it was a comedy, crime comedy, which is what I tend to love writing about criminals in a fun light. And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know any. I lived in Port Chester, New York, which is about 45 minutes outside of Manhattan and about 10 million miles away from Hollywood. And I didn't know what to do with the script. And so I opened up a phone book, a New York City phone book, and I started hunting for anybody that I could recognize a name. And I always joke, like as if, Al Pacino's name was going to be in the phone book. But I just kept hunting and hunting and hunting. And I certainly saw the William Morris Agency, but, I would call them and they wouldn't accept screenplays, unsolicited. So I had no clue what to do. And then I saw Arthur J. Ornitz's home phone number. And Arthur J. Ornitz, and I was like almost like Rain Man, with credits. I knew everybody. I knew, oh, Arthur J. Ornitz, he shot Serpico and the Anderson tapes, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I really knew my stuff because I was just loved all this stuff. So I cold called him and I said, Mr. Ronitz, my name is George Gallo. I wrote a screenplay. I don't know what to do with it. And he said to me, well, you certainly don't know what you're doing if you're calling an effing cameraman. You see, he was just a great guy. I loved Arthur. And he said, all right, send me the script. So I sent it to him, and he was old school. He called me about a week later. And he goes, kid, you can really write. I went, thank you, thank you. He goes, how old are you? And I went, 19. He goes, you're a fucking fetus, 19 years old. How can you write this stuff like this? About middle-aged angst, Well, I would just listen to my parents. So he goes, come on down, I want to meet you. So I met him for lunch. He lived on 23rd Street and 10th Avenue. I remember like it was yesterday. And we go out to lunch, and like I say, he was an old school guy. He was like three martinis at lunch. So by the third martini, he was feeling little pain. And we were talking, and he goes, you know something? He goes, you need a producer. And I was like, okay. 'Cause, I mean, well, again, like I was very naive about this stuff, you know. And he said, do you know who Marty Bregman is? And I go, yeah, Dog Day Afternoon, Serpico. Eventually would do Scarface. I said, yeah, I know who he is. He goes, well, I know Marty. I shot Serpico for Marty. He goes, get in a cab. We're going to go meet Marty Bregman. So I was like, holy shit, I couldn't believe it. So then we go into Bregman's office, and it was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Bregman was having a late lunch. I remember this. He was at his desk, and and Arthur was a little three sheets to the wind at this point. And Arthur says, hey, you got to meet this kid. This kid can F and write. And Marty goes, well, you must be good because this old bastard hates everything. I remember that. And then I gave him the script. I mean, this is like a Hollywood story. I gave him the script. He calls me a week later and he goes, kid, I want to option your screenplay. And I went, okay, what does that mean exactly? And he goes, I give you money and I own it for 18 months. You okay with that? I'm like, yeah, of course I'm okay with that. So he goes, do you have any representation? I said, what's that? Because I really didn't know, because you got a lawyer. I said, no. I'm like, dude, at that point I was driving a delivery truck in it I was delivering Hammer graphic paper. I was and Xerox paper to various machines that I would fill. And he said, well, go to the William Morris agency. Now you got an agent. His name is Fred Milstein. So it all happened very fast for me, like 2, 3 weeks. I went to the William Morris agency. Marty had called ahead, and Fred Milstein says, "I'm going to represent you in this deal. You got to fly out to Universal because they're the one that are optioning the material." Flew out to Universal, which is crazy because I've said this in the other interviews. It's right down the hill from my house, literally right there, out that window. And my house wasn't built yet. So I often think that as we pulled into Universal, that somebody would say, in about 30 years, you're going to own a house on that hillside. I would never believe it. And anyway, so they optioned the material. At one point, William Friedkin was interested in directing it. That's how I got to be good friends with Billy Friedkin. And Billy and I stayed close for decades. He passed about, what, a year and a half ago? Really good friend. Very gave me tons of great advice over the years. And but the movie never got made. But I had an agent. Then I started writing lots of scripts, and they weren't getting made. But I optioned a few of them. Ended up working for Dino De Laurentiis. I don't know if you know that story, where Dino called me in the morning. Do you know that story?
I heard you say it on a different show, but I love when you do the accent. So go ahead, feel free.
Okay, well, it was just prior to the writer's strike, and Dino had a habit of doing stuff like this, but I didn't know him. I certainly knew who he was. And I also was hanging around with a bunch of guys. They all wanted to be writers too or directors. And we used to prank each other in the worst possible ways, like, hey, I read your script. We try to disguise our voices. This is exactly what we're looking for. Really? And they go, no, it's George, you fucking asshole. So, but we would do that to each other constantly, right? So I get a phone call literally at 4 o'clock in the morning because Dino is on Italian time. And he calls me up, and I didn't know it was him. I thought it was one of these fucking guys. And so he goes, "Is this a Giorgio Gallo?" I went, "Who the fuck is this?" He goes, "This is a Dino De Laurentiis." I went, "Fuck you," and I hung up. And that's 100% true because I thought it was this guy Eddie who was really good with accents. He used to call up and do Russians and all. He just had tremendous talent with that stuff. Should have been an actor. And then the phone rings again about 5 minutes later. I'm like, Jesus Christ, pick it up. And he goes, this is Giorgio Gigallo. I went, yeah, yeah. Who the fuck is this? He goes, this is the Dino De Laurentiis. I went, oh, really? He goes, yes, I need you to come down to the Gulf and the West in the building. I need you. And I'm like, oh, wait, they don't know that. I think I just hung up on Dino De Laurentiis. Because I need you to come down to the Gulf and the West in the building. I want to hire you to write a screenplay about the Chinese mafia. Do you know anything about the Chinese mafia? I went, yeah, sure, always bullshit. Yeah, I know all about it. Yeah, yeah. He goes, so, like the next day, I went down there and he'd flown in from Italy, and
Now, George, let me stop you for a second. For those that
yeah,
don't know, Gulf and Western is the company that acquired Paramount, correct?
correct. Yeah, and they were on the corner, right across from Columbus Circle, and it's as an interesting aside, I remember not to bring the whole show down, but around the time I was writing the script was the time that John Lennon got shot, and he got shot up the street from the Gulf and Western building. And I remember I came out to the street, and it was fire engines and police cars. I'm like, what the fuck, you know? And it was Leonard had been shot. He wasn't dead yet. And then I got on the train. I went home, and by the time I got home, people on the train were buzzing about it. And by the time I got home, I turned on the radio. They were playing nothing but Beatles music, and I went, "Oh fuck, he must have died." So that was around the same. That was 1980, I think, the December of 1980. Yeah, but going back to Dino, so I wrote this script for him, and because he wanted to make he eventually made Year of the Dragon. And Year of the Dragon was based on a book, I think that John Daly, either Robert Daly or John Daly, I can't think it was John Daly, not the golfer, but the author, wrote the original book, but Dino couldn't get the rights to it. So he wanted to do a competing project. And I'll tell you this little story. And I've said this on other podcasts. Eventually Dino got the rights to Year of the Dragon, and they jettisoned my script, but they pulled scenes from it and they threw it into Year of the Dragon. There's like sequences that I wrote. But one sequence, and Oliver Stone wrote was one, co-wrote the screenplay with Michael Cimino to Year of the Dragon. But at the end of year of the script that I wrote, which was called Slaughter in Chinatown, it ended with the Chinese Godfather at the top of a staircase firing a machine gun at all these other Chinese guys who were rushing him, which ended up being at the end of Scarface,
Yep.
like the classic scene. And that was in my script years before. So when I met Oliver, I met him in Santa Barbara. I said, "Hey, did you read my script?" And he goes, "No, bullshit." Anyway, but but
Well, George,
that
George,
happens too sometimes. Sometimes you'll read something or see something, and then years later you go, "Oh, I got an idea," and you don't realize you read this earlier or saw this. That happens a lot with songwriters too. They'll hear something, it stays with them, and then they're plinking around at the piano and they think they invented it. It's not like they're consciously stealing, you
well,
know.
George, you mentioned there's that. Was he a screenwriter or somebody that was pretty prominent that told you good writers steal? Right?
Waylon Green said that to me because I said to Waylon Green when I was writing Midnight Run, Waylon's office was next to mine at Paramount. I used to go. Waylon, he's still around. He's like 88 years old. Waylon is the best, and he used to give me tons of advice. And I used to say, is it okay if I borrow an idea? And he goes, stop it. He goes, only amateurs borrow, professionals steal. And I went, okay, I'll remember that.
Going back to the Gulf and Western, going back to Dino. So okay,
Yeah.
so lead us through that part.
Well, working with Dino?
Yeah.
Oh, well, Dino said something very interesting. And look, when you're young, I didn't have this, let's say, form of mental illness as much as other people do when they're young. I don't know if you call it ego. I think because I never had a gigantic ego. I had self-confidence, but I didn't have an ego like where I wouldn't listen to other people. And I know guys that just don't listen to anybody, and then they wonder why they're not working. And I'm like, dude, why don't people they're allowed to have their opinion. And Dino said to me, he goes, I don't want anybody saying anything more than three sentences. I don't want lots of speeches between actors. He goes, I just want one sentence would be good, two okay, three the most. And I walked away thinking, that's kind of fucked up. Sometimes you do monologue, but I have to tell you, it was an amazing discipline because as I started writing that script for him, I was like, okay, blah, 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 blah. I said, I could say this in three sentences. And then I'd read and go, you know what? I could say this I could say this in one sentence and make the point. And for me, it was a great discipline, and it became kind of almost a writing style of mine where I kind of I like going Midnight Run is all back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
There's something that is said about that because I do too. And again, I'm an amateur screenwriter, but I like to make the most economical as far as the dialogue because I started realizing, okay, this is too much. I can trim some of that fat because when you're going back and forth with characters, it tends to keep the audience's attention. They say anyway.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are guys that are great at it. I think Adam Sorkin, he writes speeches for guys, but they're so beautifully structured and that I admire his ability to do it. It's not really what I like to do, but I admire it because you could just see that's like a brilliant mind firing on every cylinder when he writes those things, and and Tarantino does it quite a bit too. They people tend to speak in those long speeches. I'm more of a minimalist, in that it's like, hey, what? How are you? Because I think sometimes the gaps to me are where the music is. The silences are because it forces an audience to lean forward. It forces them to engage. But that's just my thing, like I don't like crowded dialogue generally. Like in Comeback Trail, the movie I just did, it's very back and forth. I mean, De Niro's got a big speech near the end,
Yeah.
which I co-wrote that screenplay with Josh Posner, but that one speech I wrote that speech where he goes nuts on Tommy Lee Jones. Yeah.
Well, he finally at that point he finally had it, and he
Yeah,
goes,
he blew up. He blew up. I remember when we did the table where De Niro turned to that page and he looked at the tread. He went, "Oh, Jesus Christ." I remember him mumbling because he goes, "I have to remember this entire page." And but he brought it, man. Those guys brought it. I thought they did a marvelous job on that movie.
George, did he do it verbatim or did he kind of inflect?
I always encourage people to improvise because I'm not a guy like even though I take a lot of time thinking about the dialogue, uh, and it all means something to me. But the other thing is I want the actor when I'm watching it, I want to believe it. There's nothing I hate more than guys looking like they memorized this line 3 weeks ago, you know. So I just want to believe the moment. Sometimes Bob would say, "Hey, I don't want to say anything here. I think it's better if I give him a look." I'm like, "Fine. What am I going to fucking argue with Robert De Niro?" And when you there's a very interesting thing that happens with movies. If I could tell you the Sidney Pollack story, do you know this story?
I don't know if I do. Go ahead.
Sidney Pollack was a very good friend. Also, I got to know Sidney very well. And when I got to direct my first movie, which was 29th Street, that I did for Fox, I said to Sydney, I said, look, I bullshit my way into this. I said, now I got to direct this movie. I mean, I see the movie in my head. And he says, good, that puts you ahead of a lot of directors. I said, do you have any advice? He says, yes. I'm going to give you two things that are going to save your life as a director. I went, okay. This is Sidney Pollack, right? He says, get good shoes. I went, what? He said, get good shoes. You think I'm kidding? He said, but your feet are going to fucking kill you after 2 days because you're running around and running around. And you're like a tennis player, So you need good support. I went, okay, what else you got? Get a nice hat. What's next? He said, don't be afraid to let the movie tell you what it wants to be. And I was like, huh, that made a lot of sense to me because the screenplay is one thing, and then what the movie ultimately becomes is actually something else. Because you're taking the words, you're taking the scenes, even if you shoot them verbatim, okay? The actors are going to bring something to it that's not on the page. They're going to bring more depth and more importance if they're great actors. If they're terrible actors, they could, they'll fucking destroy it. But if you have great talent, they're going to find importance in sentences that you never thought of. And I'm pretty good at figuring this shit out. And I'm always blown away when actors get into a room. You go, okay, that's why these guys get paid big dollars. I mean, they just make it feel alive and real. And they find humor in things that you didn't even suspect. And you have to allow the movie to become that because if you're not careful, you'll start pulling it back saying, oh, no, no, I can't do that because of this. And you got to think on your feet as a director. You have to allow it to become what it wants to be. It's the same thing as painting. A lot of times you're painting and you're working on a painting and you put down a color and then something happens on the canvas and you go, oh, shit, I didn't mean to do that. And then you look at it and go, oh, that's pretty nice. Maybe you're supposed to chase that now as opposed to, I scrape it out. Oh, that's not what I had in my head. So it's like an ongoing dialogue, making a movie and the movie's not really finished until it's really finished. And it's funny. I look at movies I did 20 years ago, like sometimes I'll watch one. I I have a difficult time sometimes watching my films uh, by myself. I kind of can't do it. But if I do, I start recutting them as I'm watching them. I'm like, ah, fuck, yeah, I'm going to take 2 frames off for that. I'm going to flip these two shots. These are movies that are 20 years old. I'm still making them in my head in a funny way. So I don't think, was it Michelangelo or was it Leonardo da Vinci said, art is never finished, it is merely abandoned. And I think at some point that's what happens. You got to go, all right, I think I beat this to death and I got to walk away. I mean, look at
Yeah, and that's
Coppola. Look at Coppola. He's still cutting Apocalypse Now. He's got like 14 versions of it.
almost in the vein of von Stroheim,
Yeah.
right? And Queen Kelly, the movie was
No.
never finished, you know. And I agree with you because in the short, the very first short that I completed was Washington Avenue, which originally was called The Wise Guys of Washington Avenue. And originally it was going to be a comedy, right? So I'm sitting, I'm looking at this thing, and I'm saying to myself, you know, to borrow from you or maybe to steal from you, Wise Guys, but it was supposed to be a
Please,
comedy at
yeah.
first. And but they started writing it, and it's about this character, and he's, you know, the protagonist is a guy who's got a, you know, a dead end job. He's been doing the same thing for 20 years. He's going nowhere, and he's going through a midlife crisis. And all of a sudden, as I'm writing this, it starts to turn into a drama. And I said to myself, this
Mm.
isn't a comedy at all. This is a drama, and it turned out to be a drama, but with some comedic elements in it. But to make sense of what you just said, sometimes these stories take a life of their own.
Yeah, they all should. If they're organic, they all should because you have an idea. And then Billy Friedkin used to say that. He goes, there's the movie you want to make. He says, then there's the movie you make, and then there's the movie you're left with. You know, so you basically got 3 chances to get it right. In the screenplay form, the shooting part of it, and then the editing part is almost the editing and writing are the closest because you're retelling the story as an editor. You know, it's like your last chance to get the screenplay right.
Now, if you're just a writer
Mm.
and, you know, that's just your function, how do you feel about what you've written? Then now you have someone else like a director who's now that's their vision, and then you have an editor, which is still a whole other vision. Do you feel? Have you ever felt a little bit like, God, it's not the way I really wanted this to come out, or